Hey Push Nation, welcome in to this weekend edition of our Fireside Chats. Today's topic, constitutional compromises. And a lot of this most likely is review for some of you, but I really want to focus in on some of the key issues and compromises that led to the formation of our Constitution. And first we have to look at representation. One of the most pressing issues at the convention in Philadelphia in 1787 was how the larger states and the smaller states would somehow find equal ground, common footing on the issue of representation. Now, in the Articles of Confederation government, representation was a moot point. Each state received one vote, no matter how many delegates it sent to the Congress, the unicameral Congress for that matter. And so immediately this represented quite the crisis because the larger states felt that they deserved more representation, and as you can imagine, the smaller states felt that that was too much of a threat to their power within the new framework of government. So two plans are produced, and each plan is essentially created with the idea that representation could be somewhat solved. And the first is James Madison's Virginia Plan. Madison proposed this plan, and there's actually a lot of Montesquieu embedded in Madison's plan. And what I mean by that is, of course, the idea of three branches of government. And so Madison was one of the first to actually put into writing in the United States government a model for three branches, executive, legislative, and judicial. But again, at the time, there was no executive, there was no judicial. And many Americans feared greatly the idea of an all-powerful, omnipotent executive leader. Where Madison's plan really drew the most controversy, though, was in terms of what his solution for representation was. Madison proposed that a two-house legislature would be created, an upper house and a lower house. Madison theorized that each house would be determined proportional to a state's population. Now, this was a good thing for bigger states like Virginia, where Madison was from, hence the name for the Virginia Plan. Because the larger the state and the more people, hence the more representatives he received. This upset and irked a large constituency of the state representatives who were in fact in favor of a less proportional system. And Madison would have to fight tooth and nail to get some of these measures of the Virginia Plan passed, which ultimately he did not. But along with the three branches proposal, which was again part of the Virginia Plan as well as this idea of proportional and quota-based representation, Madison also was a strong proponent of federalism, the state governments losing and sacrificing their own power on behalf of the national government. So Madison would become one of the most ardent federalists at the Constitutional Convention. Now, checking Madison along the way was a contingency of the small states led by William Paterson. And Paterson represented the state of New Jersey, hence why it's called the New Jersey Plan. So the small states counter with the New Jersey Plan. And Paterson's plan was really to go away from a quota-based proportional representation system in Congress. Instead, Paterson proposed the idea of equal representation for every state. So, in other words, no matter how big the state, no matter how small the state, everybody got the same amount of representation. Other issues that Paterson also came forward with were the idea that Congress would control and regulate revenue and taxing. That was something that the National Congress had little power over under the Articles of Confederation. Congress would also regulate, according to Paterson, commerce, so trade. And then also, like I said, in a lot of cases, Paterson was and others like him were ardently against the idea of an all-powerful federal government, especially in an executive branch. But the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan are just really the quintessential example of how the constitutional debates worked. And eventually, it took a strong sense of arbitration by Roger Sherman, who was from the state of Connecticut, and he proposed the Connecticut Plan, which is also known as the Great Compromise. And we paid homage to Mr. Sherman on a bonus question not too long ago, since he was one of two men to sign the DOI, the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution. What did Sherman propose? Well, he took a little bit of Madison, a little bit of Patterson, and he blended them. Most of what the Great Compromise deals with is the legislature, aka the Congress. And so Sherman's plan was to support the idea of a two-house branch. But he also determined that he would take Madison's idea of proportionality, quota-based population representation. That would go towards the lower house, and that was what we call today the House of Representatives. So the lower house was part of Madison's idea. The Senate, meanwhile, the upper house, was determined by equal representation. So Patterson and the small states, they got their due there with the idea of representation being equally distributed. And without a doubt, the Great Compromise, aka the Connecticut Plan, was one of the more important issues that was solved at the Constitutional Convention. Now, moving forward onto a different compromise, it's important that since we're talking about representation, we tackle two other issues that deal directly with representation. The first is voting. We've mentioned before how in the colonial governments, voting rights were determined by a few criteria, depending on where in the colonies you were. For example, in the early New England and Puritan-based societies, owning land wasn't simply enough. You had to also be an active member of the church. Whereas in Pennsylvania, for example, due to Quaker influence, you didn't have to have any participation in the church. If you owned land, you could vote. So the criteria, though, that would stick in the Constitution was, of course, land ownership. That was actually one of the core provisions in determining who could vote in elections. And over time, of course, these provisions have been reshaped, and that's why they don't appear in the Constitution anymore due to the amendment process. But one of the issues that Madison particularly was weary of were the idea of factions. And this comes up in one of his Federalist Papers, number 10, which we're going to take a look at on Tuesday, some of these documents that Madison and others wrote in defense of their ideas in the Constitution. But growing weary of an uneducated, unenlightened populace was quite pressing amongst the members of the Constitutional Convention. And the irony here is that you have very small amounts of people making decisions on behalf of a much larger population. But that lays the crux of what a representative government is. And so to achieve this unique blend of democratic-republican government, which is what the United States aimed to be, the House of Representatives was really one of the great examples of where direct election, other words, popular sovereignty, there's a term to know, popular sovereignty, the people elect, they choose. The democratic process of electing the House of Representatives was one of the truest forms of democracy embedded in the Constitution. Whereas the Senate, actually, the upper house, was initially, and for almost 2 centuries, really, or I should say 1.5 centuries, sorry on the math there, the Senate was determined by state legislatures. So there was no direct election of senators in the initial Constitution. And that, and again, was a balance that was laid into the Constitution because of the fear of an uneducated, unenlightened, uninformed populace. But the greatest compromise in voting came not in determining land ownership, which, of course, you have to agree, or you have to see the fact that land ownership was restricted to most African Americans and women. So therefore, who could vote were primarily men, white men, of course. But as far as the presidency, the executive branch election, you should know, if you're following along with 2016, that the system that was determined in the Constitution was not popular sovereignty electing the president. It was instead the Electoral College. And while I may not go into as much depth with the Electoral College in your guys' class as I would the AP government class, the Electoral College was one of the most debated topics today about what's within the Constitution. And again, the impetus for it being determined as the means for electing the president back at the convention was fear of people making such important decisions in elections of the president that really had no business getting involved in politics. And in a way, again, it's sort of a direct smack in the face to the idea of democracy and representative government because flat out the constitutional framers did not feel secure that the general population could dutifully elect a president. And so hence, that's why we have an electoral college. I think that's the third time I've said hence, by the way. Geez, I need to get off that word. Anyways, moving along here. So we've got representation compromises. We've got voting compromises with the electoral college and the difference between electing the Congress. But one of the most important compromises is certainly going to be slavery. And again, we could argue this till we're blue in the face, but put yourself in the shoes of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention. There were certain states that would have walked out of Philadelphia if slavery was banned in the Constitution. That we know for sure because of how ingrained slavery was becoming in the economies of the southern states. And keep in mind that at the time, when the Constitutional Convention was written, almost all the states remained, and I'm going to show you a map here, but almost all the states remained still having slavery. It's remarkable to think about that it took years, even after the Constitution was written, for some of the northern states to ban slavery. We always think of the South being the only institution, having slavery be its institution, but slavery was available and was in practice all throughout the states. But there were some from the North that really argued vocally against slavery. And one of those was Gouverneur Morris, the same guy who wrote the preamble. And I'm going to pop up a really nice passage that he stated at the convention in basically damning his fellow representatives at the convention for allowing slavery's passage into the Constitution. And equally, I'm going to show you another passage here from a South Carolina delegate named Charles Pinckney defending slavery's addition into the Constitution. And when I say addition, what I mean is that since there was no ban on slavery, it essentially was allowed to be in there. There is one particular clause in Article 4 that deals with extradition. That's the Fugitive Slave Clause. So slavery was addressed in the Constitution vaguely with the Fugitive Slave Clause in Article 4 that allowed Southerners to go into northern states and recover runaway slaves. However, slavery was not itself addressed, but what was addressed was the idea of representation of African American slaves. And this is where the argument really became heated. And this is also where we arrive at the Three-Fifths Compromise. So many slaves living in states like Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia could have shifted the balance of power in the United States tremendously towards the South. So northern states, if they couldn't get slavery banned on moral grounds, they had to fight it on political grounds, and representation was really the cornerstone issue involving the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now, your average populace, your average person in the United States counted for one vote. And that would guarantee how the states got their members in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College as well, because the Electoral College is based on the number of senators and representatives that a state has. So if slaves were in fact in the population count, then that would tip the balance of power towards the South. So the compromise was that African Americans would count as 3/5 towards a vote. That does not guarantee in any way, shape, or form that African Americans had any voting rights whatsoever. It just means that one slave equaled 3/5 a person as far as the population count. It may seem difficult from our perspective today to understand why people did not take a stronger stance against slavery in the Constitution. However, again, put yourself back, like I said earlier, in the shoes of what was going on. The prevailing theory was if the southern states walked, the entire revolution would have been for naught. And so therefore, there was no mention of slavery outside of the Fugitive Slave Clause and the Three-Fifths Compromise in the Constitution. Other than that, again, there's some key facts of the Constitution I'm going to throw up there for you. We're going to look throughout the year, especially at different roles each branch plays, legislative, judicial, and executive branch. And then, of course, the idea of checks and balances. One of the most revolutionary theories of the Constitution. Certainly, it was a unique system in the United States and government, and we will evaluate that throughout the year. And then just a little trivia here. 13 states Rhode Island was the last of the 13 to ratify the Constitution in 1790. New Hampshire actually gets the distinction of being the 9th of 13 states, and New Hampshire's 9th meant that the Constitution was good to go. We are also going to address on Tuesday the Bill of Rights, and so that's another chunk of the Constitution that I want to get into with you guys, and we'll do that on Tuesday. For now, I'm going to just leave you with that, and remember, tomorrow we got the pro se courts on how, in fact, revolutionary was the American Revolution. I can't wait for those debates. Have a great rest of your weekend, everybody, and remember, the past shapes the future. Take care.